So hi, everyone. My name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson, and I'm the rabbi of Port Jewish Center in Port Washington, New York. And I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight to our program with author Meryl Ain. I know that when I'm welcoming you, I'm welcoming actually people from congregations, from small congregations up and down the East Coast, a couple in the middle of the country as well. And so we have a nice consortium of small synagogues who are coming together to learn together and to hear about great books together. So it's my pleasure to welcome our author Meryl Ain. I want to tell you just a little bit about her before we just turn things over to her completely. Meryl's articles and essays have appeared in the Huffington Post, the New York Jewish Week, the New York Times, Newsdays, and other publications. She's authored two books, I think at least two books, both award-winning. One, The Living Memories Project, Legacies That Last, and then in 2016, a companion workbook, My Living Memories Project Journal. And then, of course, she wrote this book, The Takeaway Man, which we're talking about this evening. She holds a BA from Queens College, a master's from Teachers College, Columbia University, a doctorate, I think, from Hofstra University in education. She's a lifetime member of Hadassah, an active supporter of Federation, and she lives in New York with her husband, Stuart. They have 3 sons and 6 grandchildren. And this, as I said, is her first novel. Also, for those of you who are from Port Washington, Ms. Ain and I were just talking about how her first job is actually teaching history at our high school here in Port Washington, Schreiber High School. So maybe one of your kids had Miss Ain. Were you Miss Ain at the time?
Well, first I was Miss Fishman, then I became Mrs. Ain.
So Meryl is here talking about her book, although her book, The Takeaway Men, and if you read it, which I did, you know it's a fantastic story. And if you didn't, this is a great opportunity to learn more about it. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Meryl, and we're looking forward to learning with you tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Mendelson, and I'm so excited. I was excited to come back to Port Washington virtually, but I didn't realize we'd also have people from all over the country. So this is very exciting, and I should mention that my son Jonathan, daughter-in-law Beth, and their 2 children also live in Port Washington. So I have a lot of connections to your town. The Takeaway Men is my debut novel. And as the rabbi mentioned, the vast majority of my published writing has been nonfiction. But I wanted to write a post-Holocaust novel, not a Holocaust one. And I thought that this story could best be told in fiction, in a novel. As you may know, Holocaust novels are the best-selling category on Amazon. But I wanted to write about the little told story of what happened to the survivors and their children after the war was over. You know, there's a lot of focus on the war, on the Holocaust, but not nearly as much on what happened to these survivors after the war. So they were unable or unwilling to return to their homes in Europe, and they had to leave and start new lives in countries where they did not speak the language nor understand the culture. And when they arrived, they may have experienced prejudice and discrimination. In addition, as we all know now, I don't know how much people knew or admitted they knew right after the war. They had just been subject to the most horrific cruelty and trauma in human history. At the same time, there was no term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There weren't support services to deal with emotional and psychological issues. And by the way, the term Holocaust, as well as the word survivor, had not yet come into use. What we now call survivors were referred to then as refugees or greeners. And I mention this because this week I just happened to catch a documentary called The Long Way Home, which was produced in the late 90s. And I had never seen it before. I really thought I had seen almost everything that there was, but this was an amazing documentary. It's narrated, and I recommend it. It's narrated by Morgan Freeman, with historical footage, much of which at least I hadn't seen before, and I don't think most people have seen it before. It describes how incredibly difficult it was right after the war for the remnant who survived. They were unwelcome in their own home countries and in most of the world. And it wasn't until the state of Israel was created in 1948 and the United States later relaxed its immigration laws, because at the beginning they had very strict immigration laws, and our country was more hospitable to non-Jewish refugees than Jewish refugees. So after the state of Israel was created and the US opened up, people were able to leave the displaced persons camps in large numbers. And the documentary shockingly shows, through actual film shot at the time, how the world turned its back on the Jews who survived. So I'm writing this book I wrote this book about survivors. So The Takeaway Men is about fraternal twins, Bronka and Jojo Lubinski, and their parents, who come to New York, Queens to be exact, from a DP camp in the years after World War II. As new immigrants, they experience the difficulties of adjusting to American culture, as well as the burgeoning fear of the Cold War. So while they're fortunate to find a home with cousins they've never met, they still have very much to learn about their new country. The Lubinski family, carrying the baggage of their years of trauma and dislocation, had to navigate an unfamiliar terrain and language. So the twins, who come here when they are 3.5, and then we watch them grow over the years, they went to school, they went to public school, and they played inventive games with their friends. But because of the nuclear threat from the Russians at that time, they also had to participate in take cover drills where they crouched under their desks. And this, of course, was very scary for all the children. And they heard things, even if their parents made a great effort to hide everything from them. Their father, who had aspired to be a doctor, ends up working in the cousin's bakery. And the twins learn about American toys and kids' television. They're introduced to the Tiny Tears doll and Howdy Doody, for those of you who are old enough to remember. And the first week the family is in Queens, a neighbor gets arrested for her suspected involvement in the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg spy case. And this evokes horrific memories and fear on the part of the adults, and anxiety and terror in the children. So in The Takeaway Men, I wanted to explore the impact of immigration, Jewish identity, prejudice, secrets, and lies on parents and children. I wanted to raise important questions in the book that are both specific to that time period, but are also timely and timeless. Aaron and his wife, Judy, the parents of the twins, are the keepers of the family secrets. And Aaron has forbidden his wife to discuss their history with their children. Still, as the girls get older, they start to wonder about their parents' past, and they begin to demand answers. So besides Judy and Aaron, who have secrets from the Holocaust, a number of the other adults in the book are also harboring secrets, including a neighbor with an extramarital affair, a child who suffers from mental illness, and an unlikely store clerk with a Nazi past. So the rabbi mentioned that I was a history teacher at one point in my career, and I've taught about the Holocaust. I've researched and read about it, and I plan programs. As a child, I heard the word concentration camp slip from my mother's tongue, and I should say right now that my parents were not survivors. Both my parents were not only born here, but they both served in World War II, but yet they tried to shield us, and we lived in a small house, and I had very big ears. So I asked my mother, what's a concentration camp? And she gave me a copy of the Diary of Anne Frank to read when I was in the 6th grade. And I immediately identified with Anne, but when I finished, I wanted to know what happened to her. So as you know, the book ended before the family was captured, and there's no mention of concentration camps. And I think I've been seeking answers about the Holocaust ever since. So when I was growing up, the word Holocaust, in reference to the murder of the 6 million, as I mentioned, did not even exist yet. It did not come into vogue until the late 70s. There was a mini series on NBC called The Holocaust. So to illustrate that point, I included a scene where a Hebrew school teacher is telling her class about Hitler and the final solution, which is how it was referred to back then. And the principal finds out about this and reprimands her for sharing her tragic experience with the students. While this is pure fiction, it shows how our attitudes about Holocaust education have changed markedly since the 1950s. As you can read in the novel, Americans, including Jews, did not want to focus on the past during this time period. And much has changed since then. In fact, the Never Again Education Act, which became law in 2020, specifically provides funds for Holocaust education in middle and high schools throughout the through the United States Holocaust Museum. But there are only 17 states in the country that mandate Holocaust education. And yes, New York is one of them. So as we continue to lose survivors, and studies show that many young people are unfamiliar with the Holocaust, I believe it's more important than ever to inform them about what happened. This year, I was honored to be appointed to the International Advisory Board for Holocaust Survivor Day, which is a new holiday that will be observed every year to honor survivors. And I hope that the Takeaway Men helps to shed light not only on the horrors of the past, but on the resilience and strength of the survivors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think if we weren't interested, if we haven't read the book already and we weren't interested or weren't sure, we're sold on it now, Meryl. But that being said, I wanted to follow up with a few questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And so the first one, and let's be honest, Meryl suggested these questions to me. I don't want to take credit because they're really good questions. So I don't want you to think I'm brilliant, because I mean, I might be, but it's not because of these questions. Meryl did this all on her own. Okay, so the first question is, what are the challenges of writing about the Holocaust or Holocaust survivors in fiction?
Okay. A couple of months ago, I participated in a panel discussion with other authors about writing about Holocaust fiction. So, not, fiction, right? Nonfiction is true. fiction is not true, but I feel very strongly, and this goes really for any historical fiction, that you've got to get those background facts correct. But I feel even more strongly about when you're writing about the Holocaust, you must do your homework. You must do meticulous research. You can't make stuff up. And, you know, enough horrible things happened that you can find them. I mean, this is not a book, but I will give an example of something that bothered me a lot. There was a Netflix series. What was the name of it? The Captors, I think. I don't even remember the name of it. Al Pacino was in it.
Hunters.
What was it called?
The Hunters.
The Hunters, right. And the premise of it was that these survivors were going around capturing and killing former Nazis. Well, that really didn't happen. I mean, the survivors that we know, I mean, I don't know that there are any examples of that, but you know, possibly, but I don't think so. And they were so beaten down. Or on the other hand, and this is one thing which, you know, maybe we'll get to later, there was a wide range of behaviors and responses. So, you know, some of them really were just beaten down, and some of them, because they had survived, they weren't afraid to take risks, and they became wildly successful. This is not unusual that there were survivors. In fact, I think there are something like 7 or 8 Nobel Peace Prize winners who were Holocaust survivors. So there was a wide range, but in this film, so the premise of it, that these survivors were going around killing former Nazis en masse. And then they had a flashback to a scene in a concentration camp where, if anybody saw this, they had a chessboard with human chess players. And if somebody made a mistake or was, I don't know, I'm not a chess player, but the person was out, they shot them. And there were articles written about this. There was a lot of criticism because this indeed never happened. It never happened. It's not documented. And, you know, there's enough horrible stuff that happened that you can base it on something that happened. So the challenge is that you almost have to start out as if you are writing nonfiction. I mean, I did a huge amount of research about every aspect, whether it was DP camps or the Kels pogrom, which we can get to later if you want to. So I think that that's the challenge. And I think it's particularly important because we have to transmit the truth about the Holocaust, because if we start making up stuff, that just feeds into Holocaust deniers. So I think it's just a question of really doing your homework. And then, of course, I mean, the characters can do anything you want them to do, but it's got to be within the framework of the true history of the time.
I actually thought, you know, at the very end of the novel, it has a note from the author, and you kind of go through everything and you say, you know, this part was true, this was from my imagination. And I actually found it really interesting just to kind of, you know, you added just a couple of other points of history in there and you know, points of information. And I thought it was really helpful, and I don't know, it actually added a little bit of color in my mind to the book.
Thank you.
So how did you do your research?
Well, as I said, I have kind of been studying this since I read the Diary of Anne Frank. So I have read every book I can find about it. I have watched every film. I read primary sources, and I have had friends of the family who were survivors, and I have a number of friends who are children of survivors and even grandchildren of survivors. So I've spoken to them, I've interviewed them. I felt a tremendous responsibility because I'm not a child of survivors, that I had to get it right. So, you know, some of my friends who were 2Gs read it, and, you know, one of the biggest compliment I got was they said, you know, you got it right because you didn't paint us with one brush stroke. There's a big range of how people responded to their family's history. Now, it impacts everybody, it affects everybody, but everybody's different. So they respond to it in different ways. So, I mean, I had some primary sources, and I honestly, well, now I'm writing a sequel, but even before that, I always researching it because, like, we put on the fire stick and my husband says, "So what do you want to watch?" And I said, find a Holocaust movie or find a Nazi movie. You know, it's my thing. And I'm not quite sure why, but it is.
I think you just made a few people happy, including me, when you said you're writing a sequel, because I do
Oh,
want to know
thank
what
you.
happens next.
Thank you.
So were you surprised in terms of anything that you found? Did I just
Yeah.
and how did I already ask you that?
No.
No. Okay.
Well, not really. I can answer that. So one of the things I started mentioning, but I can elaborate on it, and then the other thing I'll mention. So I was surprised at the really difficult time that most survivors had when they came to this country, and you know, you wouldn't really expect that. And even from the Jewish community, of course, you know, there were Jewish organizations that reached out, and there were many relatives who took in people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the really, and this film, The Long Way Home, that I just saw, really reinforces this, that people, your general population, they weren't interested. They weren't interested in hearing about it anymore. The war was over. The GIs came back. They got married. They had families. They built homes, and life was moving forward, and they didn't want to hear about it. And, you know, many said they didn't realize what happened. So, I mean, like I said, there was no counseling, there was no outlet. There wasn't much interest in it. And the other thing that was really shocking to me is that the United States government, right after, I guess by 1946, no longer they weren't concerned about Nazis anymore. They were concerned about communists. They were concerned about the Red Scare. And of course, we all know what happened, you know, with the McCarthy hearings and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which is touched on in the book. And it was all about, you know, that we were going to be annihilated by the Soviet Union, and there were communists hiding under every bed. So one of the things that really shocked me was that the US government invited approximately 1,500 former Nazis to come to the US and become citizens. And they invited them to work in three different capacities: the space program, the nuclear program, or to be spies, to find communists. And this came out later, and there were even and this, I might get to this in the next book, but the OSI, which was the Office of Special Investigations, which looked into these Nazis, it didn't come into existence until 1979. So there were some isolated cases. There was a woman in Queens, Hermione Bronsteiner Ryan, and she actually got deported, but that was initiated by Simon Wiesenthal. So that I was like horrified by. The other thing, which interestingly, this film that I saw 2 nights ago also had in it, and I had never heard of it until we were in the Berkshires one summer, and I was trying to decide where my characters would come from. And they have a Jewish film festival there, and we saw a film called Bogdan's Journey, which was about the Kels pogrom. And this was more than a year after the war was over in Europe, in Poland, where there was an actual pogrom, and approximately 40 Jews were killed and injured by a mob of police, soldiers, townspeople. And I said, how could, that was shocking to me, how could that happen a year after the war was over? So that was very disillusioning. So those things really surprised me.
Yeah, somebody wrote in the comments, I'm trying to find it here. Just saying that I was angry when I learned that our government gave Nazis sanctuary. I read that they did this because they didn't want them to go to Russia.
Yes,
so,
well, it was a brain drain, the ones that the 1500, like Werner von Braun, and those people were, many of them were, the brains. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, I was just thinking as you were talking, and I think this is actually from, I don't know, or a little bit earlier what you said, but when you think about the fact that in light of everything that they faced when they got to this country, the survivors who came here did as well as they did. It's really miraculous. And, and you kind of understand when you look at the character of Aaron, how, in some ways he's putting one step in front of the other, and that in itself is a tremendous achievement. It's so hard to just even imagine, you think about this idea of all these GIs coming home, starting families, and it's like, they're moving forward and they're carrying so much less than these survivors who came to this country. It's really miraculous.
And they wanted to, there were big theme among the survivors, and many of them got married quickly without knowing their partners very well. Many of them had lost spouses during the war, and they started having children right away. They started having them in the DP camps, and there was a very high marriage rate and birth rate, because they wanted to prove Hitler that he had not eliminated the Jews. So
yeah. So I'm going to ask this next question, but then I'm actually going to ask Marcia Appel to comment on the question first, and you'll understand why in a minute.
Okay.
The question is, how did you choose the locales in your book? Mainly where your main characters were coming from and where they were going. But with respect to the locales, Marcia, do you want to just comment really quickly?
Okay, so I'm assuming you grew up in Glen Oaks or near.
I grew up in Belrose, on the other side, on the south side of Union Turnpike,
Right.
on 251st Street.
So I grew up in Bell Park on the other side of Van Buren, right next to it.
Okay.
And so everything you described there is all very, very familiar. I felt I was reading my childhood, although I think, I can relate to most things that you cover there. But yeah, no, you did a phenomenal job
Thank you.
of sort of bringing back a lot of things about daily life of children growing up in Queens at that time, whether Holocaust survivor related or not. The fact that women didn't drive very often, and that you'd walk to the bakery, and all of those things, and maize and dance, all those places. But anyway.
Yeah, I think people who grew up around there got a even bigger kick out of it.
Yeah.
I kind of tickled myself when I was writing it. Yeah.
I think you're a couple of years earlier than I was, but
Okay.
I definitely could relate to that. But back to your question, Rabbi.
Okay, yeah, I just muted the wrong person. I met Meryl, can you unmute yourself? I meant to mute Marcia.
Okay, I'm
muted
unmuted.
you.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, good. So, okay, so but I wanted to give Marcia a chance to say something, because I know she was so incredibly tickled by like all the descriptions of her neighborhood.
Her name.
So, okay, so how did you choose the locales, and also where mainly where your characters were coming from and where they were going?
Okay, so let me, I'll piggyback on what Marcia said, because that makes more sense. So, I'm a big fan of Philip Roth's, and one of the reasons I've read almost every book he's written is because he sets the book in New Jersey, especially Newark, and I was actually born in Newark, and came to Queens when I was a baby, but my father was born in Newark, and I found out that my grandfather, whom I never knew, was actually born in Newark. A second cousin sent me within the last year or so his death certificate, and he actually worked for the Metropolitan Life Company, which is where many of Philip Roth's characters work. So I thought that would work for me. They say write what you know. So I decided to set it in my hometown. As far as where they were going to come from, that was a big decision, and it took me a long time. I thought Germany, and then I said, no, that's been done, and France has been done, and Holland is too much like Anne Frank. So I kind of settled on Poland, but then I started researching different towns in Poland, and they had to have a ghetto, and they had to have a forest. And but I was pretty sold on Poland. And then we went to this Jewish film festival, and I found out about the Kielce pogrom, and I said, they've got to come from Kielce. I mean, that to me, the Kielce pogrom is horrific, but it's also a terrible metaphor for, when will they ever learn? When will we ever learn? Don't people ever learn? So I wanted to, raise certain issues, and that's why I chose Kielce. But I also, what was really interesting was this documentary I saw where they mentioned the Kielce pogrom, because most people have not heard of it, and I certainly hadn't heard of it or read about it before I saw this film. And they mentioned in this documentary that 90,000 Polish Jews headed towards Germany after the pogrom, and Aaron and Judy are in that group. I didn't realize they were in a group of 90,000 when I read the book.
And I'm the mom of twins, so
Oh,
you had, yes. So
are they identical or fraternal?
They are very fraternal.
A boy and a girl?
2 boys, and I'm looking. My mother and my mother-in-law are sitting next to each other in Florida and New York, but on my screen, and they both are shaking their heads. Very different. It's very funny. So anyway, but so I'm curious. Why did you choose twins as your main characters?
Okay, well, I chose twins for a number of reasons. So one of the reasons I mentioned before, was that I wanted to show the range. I didn't want to make either the survivors or their children into stereotypes, although they were all impacted in some way. They were impacted in different ways. So I thought a good vehicle would be the twins. So you have, Bronka, who's haunted and very sensitive and wants to heal her father. And then Jojo on the opposite extreme, she's embarrassed by his accent, and she just wants to be an American girl. So I thought that was a good way to illustrate that. Now, how did I come to that decision? Well, I am married to an identical twin. I decided not to make them identical, just in case it's made into a movie or a Netflix series. It would be easier. No kidding. So I just decided the fraternal twins would work better. But I'm married to an identical twin, and I actually met my husband when I was on a blind date with his brother. And he and his brother, now they don't look exactly the same, but for many years, people could not tell them apart. I mean, he was the best man in our wedding, and people laughed when he walked down the aisle, and I made him wear a different color shirt, and people gave him envelopes anyway. But the point is, I said they have the same container, but they have different souls. They have different values. They have different characters. I mean, they're really so different. So I'm very familiar with twins, so that I decided that I would do twins to illustrate that.
So I have a few more questions, but I thought I would just, if anyone had a comment that they wanted to make or ask a question of their own, I thought I would give people a chance to do that now. If you want me to call on you, just put your name in the chat, and I'm happy to call on you that way. And I'm just going to read some of the comments just so that you can hear them. So Faye Levinson wrote, she's joining from Skokie, Illinois. She's a child of survivors. She grew up in Forest Hills. And she said, my family ended up in Forest Hills because many of my parents' friends from the DP camp in Zelsheim, Germany, settled in Rego Park, Forest Hills. And these friends stayed lifelong friends. And then and Bela, who, she wrote, I'm so glad to read a book about the post-Holocaust life of survivors rather than the story of their experiences during the war. You bring up so many aspects of the complexities of trying to find a place to belong after such a horrifying experience. I don't think there are many other novels that address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and you answered one of the questions, I think a little bit, are the characters all a product of your imagination or based on real people?
Well, every author, it's all a composite. It's all a composite. So one of the survivor, so one of the friends of our family who was a survivor owned a couple of bakeries. So I got the idea of the bakery, but was his character the same as Aaron? No, absolutely not. He owned a lot of real estate, and he became incredibly successful. So you asked me about the research. So in addition to interviewing survivors and children of survivors and knowing them, there are some really good materials and books that were written. So there's Helen Epstein, who actually I think it was the late 70s, wrote an article in the New York Times where she identified children of survivors, which they call second generation or 2Gs, as a distinct group with issues. And she was the first person who identified that. She's written a couple of books about, and where she's interviewed children of survivors. Menachem Rosensaft wrote a book where he has essays from many children of survivors. So there, it's all a composite. As I said, it's all based on something, but can you point to a particular person and say that's so and so? Absolutely not.
Joyce Lansman, you have your hands raised. You're muted though, Joyce.
I also wanted to thank you for writing a book post-Holocaust, because I think since I was 9, I was aware of the horrors of the Holocaust. And of course, we knew that people survived, but you brought to life what it was really like. The other question I have for you, because I have a friend who is second generation. What happens to third generation? Is there anybody understand? Do they finally forget their grandparents' experiences, or does that also still taper, or I should say, guide them into the way they look at the world?
Well, it's interesting. And there are people, studying it now, and there are 3G groups where they get together. And again, I've not really, I'm not an expert on this. I've not studied it, but my understanding is that something that was fairly typical, with exceptions, always with exceptions. And I have the exceptions in my book. I have Aaron, who won't say a word about his experience, and then Jacob Zilberman, who won't stop talking about it. But for the most part, especially because no one was interested in listening right after, many of the survivors did not talk to their children about it. It was just too painful, and they didn't want to burden their children, even though the children knew something was wrong. However, by the time their grandchildren came along, the whole topic kind of opened up. So you had Holocaust museums, you had the World Gathering of Holocaust Survivors, you had 2G groups. People were talking about it. So you had grandparents. So right over here in Glen Cove, you have the Holocaust Museum and Tolerance Center. And early on, they started training speakers and then having Holocaust survivors go to schools and speak to the kids. So there were survivors, and just like my father, who was a soldier in World War II in Europe, he never said a word to my brother and me, but he talked to my kids about it. So what I understand is that some of the survivors, who took them a long time to talk to their own children about it, talked more freely to their grandchildren. A number have gone, back to Poland or visited a concentration camp with their children and grandchildren. But I assume somebody's probably studying the third generation as we speak, but I don't really know any more than that.
I just want to add that, from a rabbinic perspective, one of the things that we do, I know certainly I've done in my congregation, is that I try, when we have a student who has a grandparent or even a great grandparent who's a survivor, we try to get that child to learn to really if their grandparent is still living, to interview them. And this is like nothing new is under the sun. Like this is, lots of my colleagues are doing this, and there are projects, all over the country for this. But in our congregation, we also try to get that child to share the story, on Yom HaShoah, and kind of we really emphasize with our kids, like, this is part of your history. This is something that you need to know. This is a story you have to carry with you and share with other people, because, I can't speak to this in the way I think you could, Meryl, but, these survivors are they're getting older and older. And so, is soon enough, in 30 years from now, there won't be any survivors left. I mean, in less time probably than that. But so this is really the moment, like, this is it. And it's so powerful when we hear, these stories, and for our kids, to really understand, the fact that they're here is no small miracle.
It is, and I think that it's been probably therapeutic and healing for the survivors. So I was working in as an administrator in a Smithtown school district, and we brought in a speaker, a survivor from the, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, along with a young woman who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And they did a program together, which was really an amazing program. But, I think what happened was, there was nothing, let's say when I was growing up, then with my kids, they said, oh, they just talked about the Holocaust so much. But now what I wanted to say was there was a survey commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, a 50-state survey of Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Generation Z. 63% of those surveys did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And while there were more than 40,000 concentration camps and ghettos established during World War II, about half of those polls were unable to name a single one. And then 1 in 10 respondents claimed they never heard the word Holocaust before. So I think where we live, where it's not like that, but I would think in other parts of the country, perhaps.
So is there anyone else who has a question? Just seeing, or a comment? I can't tell if anyone's raising their hand. So if you do, you can let me know. Okay. So who do you think should read your book?
Well, I think, okay. So
especially in light of what you just said.
Well, when I first, okay, so my first book, which I wrote with co-authors, we wanted to make it ecumenical. And in retrospect, I think it was a mistake. I think we should have made it just a Jewish book. So I just kind of said, I'm embracing this and Jews will read it. And much to my surprise, I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who aren't Jewish, who like it and have read it, felt it, they learned a lot. And they appreciated the fact that I, had mention of righteous Gentiles in there. So adults should read it, but I also think, I think teenagers can read it as well. And somebody suggested to me that I should probably put together a teacher's guide, which I haven't had a chance to do so far. But I think what somebody told me is that she thought it would be good for kids because it's just enough about the Holocaust. It's not a tremendous amount of gore. But the other thing that is so important about my book is, as I said, I wrote it in fiction because I wanted to raise certain questions. And, those questions were, how do we treat people who are different than we are, especially immigrants? What do we do when we see evil in the world? Do we look the other way? Do we join in? Do we try to stop it? Do we speak out? So I think that these are very, very important questions for then, and they're just as timely for today.
So have you actually, I was just thinking, have any of your grandchildren read the book and have you talked about it with them?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, I have 2 who would be in the age group that might read it. The others are too young, but yeah, I'd love for them to read.
Could be
they're so busy, right?
I totally understand. I can't imagine any of my kids being in a, I love you, Mom and Lynn, but I can't imagine any of my kids being in a book group with you right now. So eventually. So what has it been like trying to launch a book during the pandemic?
Well, it's been very interesting. At first, I was like all authors, I was very upset and very disappointed. I've had 2 in-person events this year, and everything else was virtual. But what I did was I challenged myself. I just put it out there because I did the Jewish Book Council this year. I didn't do it the first year. I said, let me just see what I can do myself. And I think I've met with about 65 different groups. All over. I met with a group in Israel and Canada and Milwaukee and locally. And I could never, I mean, I don't want to say that the pandemic was good, but the silver lining was I would never have reached this many people going from place to place.
It's really,
So
it's really, sorry, it's really an amazing thing.
It's amazing. And, when I think that when we had our Zoom Seder in April 2020, I didn't even know what Zoom was. And now I'm just zooming all the time. But, look, people, somebody wrote on Facebook, she was disappointed. And of course, I'd love to meet all my readers in person, but I do think you can just reach a lot more people this way. People don't have to go anywhere, if it's bad weather, or, I don't know. So
and you're right, you're in all of our living rooms or bedrooms or kitchens or our offices, and it's so nice.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Rayfeld, will you just unmute yourself and make the comment that you wrote in the chat really quickly? If you can unmute yourself. You're unmuted,
Hi.
Jacqueline.
Are you?
Oh, she muted herself again. You were unmuted and then you muted yourself, Jacqueline.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi. Which comment about the location game that we
Yes.
played?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Meryl.
Hi.
I grew up and I still live on 256th Street.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
What avenue? Where?
between Union Turnpike and 79 and 80th Avenue.
Oh, wow.
I was curious because my friends, we've all read the book and we loved it. And we played the location game, trying to figure out like the temple. Were you referring to Belrose Jewish Center or Young Israel?
Well, I was referring to, they belong to, I guess, what would have been Belrose Jewish Center. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what we thought, because all of us belong to Belrose, and we were trying
Right.
to figure out if it was Belrose or not. And also, I worked in Maze when I was in college, and some of my friends worked in Dan's and in the Garden Bake Shop. And my friend who worked in the Garden Bake Shop was convinced, and it seemed like that the story takes place, a lot of it, in the Garden Bake Shop.
Well, I don't want to disillusion you. So there was the Garden Bake Shop, and then there was another one
Right.
on the other side of Little Neck Parkway in
Right.
around 247th Street, which was a Glen Oaks Bakery. It was a smaller one. But the baker that I told you about, who was the family friend who owned the bakeries, he had a bakery out here in Suffolk County, and we live in Comac, so it was in Deer Park. And the bakery was just a mishmash of all the bakeries that I loved in my life. And there are no more bakeries.
I know, it's
County.
terrible.
I don't know about Nassau. Are there? Are there any bakeries?
Oh, yeah. Come to Port Washington. We've got lots of bakeries here, Ashley. Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
Okay, I'll mute myself again.
Her comments were just so, I was reading her comments and I was like, you have to share this because, you're in the neighborhood.
Right.
Okay, so just tell us what's next and where can we find you?
Great. Okay, so I am writing a sequel. I am a little more than halfway through the first draft. Hopefully, it will be published in the spring of 2023. And it's going to pick up in the 60s and probably go into the 70s and 80s. So the twins are going to grow up. And you can find me. I'm all over Facebook. Bela and other people know Jews love to read. I started a Facebook group. My personal page is Meryl Ain. I'm Meryl Ain author. My website is, guess what, merylain.com. So you can find me there, and you can email me through my website if you want to. You can send me a Facebook message. I love to hear from people, and I just appreciate the interview, Rabbi, and all the kind words. It's really been a great evening, and I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So friends, again, tomorrow, or I can't promise tomorrow, but sometime over the next few days, you will be receiving an email from me, and in that email will be a link to buy Meryl's book. If you haven't already, you should definitely pick it up, or pick it up for yourself, pick it up for a friend. It's, as you can tell, it's a great read. A lot of us who have already read the book of Janice is holding up her copy. A lot of us have already read it.
I had mine right here. See?
Yep, there you go. Hold it up. A couple of people are holding it up. I read it on my phone. There's Marcia holding her copy up. There's Geraldine holding hers up. So, but if you haven't picked it up, you can do that. Also, I'm going to be sending you a link to this program. So if you if you think that a friend might enjoy hearing Meryl's talk, you can forward my email along to them, and they'll be able to watch tonight's program. I just wanted to let you know our next program is on November 3rd at 1 p.m. Normally our programs are at 8, but this one is at 1 p.m. With Lori Benov Kaufman, who wrote the book Rebel Daughter. And I think she's coming to us from Israel?
I think she's in Israel. Yeah.
Israel. Yes. Yeah. She's coming to us from Israel. And there'll be information about that talk as well. So anyway, thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. Meryl, thank you so much. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
And read the book and take its message to heart, my friends. Let's keep telling the story of our people.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here.